Today we're going to start the new adventure in the book of First Chronicles. We're going to be going over the message for the Jews and also the message of First Chronicles for you and me. We're going to discuss the idea of why these names are here in the genealogies that just start from scratch. What's the point? And what's some observations we can make about these genealogies if we pay attention? And today we're going to talk about that. If you missed what First Chronicles is all about, be sure to watch that video in the beginning of this playlist. We're going to continue our discussion today in the first 27 verses of chapter 1, and we'll do that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study, help you study, help you mark up your Bible, help you apply God's Word to your life. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and Kyle and I are going to continue our study in First Chronicles, kind of an overlooked book in the Old Testament. A lot of people start to read it and they'll get 2 chapters in and just give up. Today, we're going to be in the first section that we've identified as going from Adam to Abraham and the genealogies of the purpose of the chronicler. Okay?
All right.
Right out of the chute, let me ask a question. We saw last week in the introduction that the chronicler is taking us through the lineage of Messiah and also the lineage of the priests for the temple. And we could stop and ask ourselves the question, okay, we got that, but what does that have to do with me? What are these verses saying to me that I can take away?
Yeah.
I decided to start with a quote. There's a book by Dana Gould called The Old Testament. In that, he's talking about First Chronicles, the first 9 chapters. And he says this: the genealogies are not a sterile recitation of names. They are a significant statement of Israel's place in the whole sweep of God's plan for the world. The chronicler founds the proper appreciation of universal history in the founding of Israel, the appointment of David, and the building of the temple where God resides in the world. And that's a foretaste of the true temple of Jesus Christ, who resides in the world first as a man, and then going into heaven, he resides in the world through the Holy Spirit indwelling the believers. I think we can take from our initial study a blessing of saying, if we are believers, if we're Christians, this is really our history.
Yeah.
And it's significant that God is interested in recording for us how our faith as a Christian was founded all the way from Adam through to the temple. So that's an overview of an application that we can take into these chapters and into these verses.
All right.
Now we're going to start at verse 1 again. Let's get into that. And what we're going to do, Kyle, is we're just going to observe some interesting things as we go. So let's get into that. I'm not going to have you read the verses like we normally would, because that would just be mean. We're going to look at these verses from verse 1 down to verse 4, and we're going to start to notice some things. The first thing we noticed, we mentioned last week, in the first phrase, Adam, Seth, Enosh, that there is no Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is Cain kills Abel. Abel is out of the line of the Messiah, and Cain is cursed, and he's out of the line of Messiah. So he becomes irrelevant in the book of Chronicles.
All right.
So it goes right from Adam to Seth. Now, Seth is an important figure because we talked about this a little bit, but I want you to flip over. In fact, I want you to put your finger in the book of Genesis because we're going to be flipping back and forth quite a bit because there's a lot of parallels between some genealogies in Genesis with genealogies here. But I want you to look when it says Seth, that's a name that's familiar. And one of the things that it says is Genesis chapter 4, verse 26.
To Seth also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then people began to call upon the name of the Lord.
Okay, so we get Adam and Eve and they sin. We get Cain and Abel, and that obviously turns into a tragedy. Cain is cursed. Then they have another child, Seth. Now, if we think back, you remember Adam and Eve sinned and they were cast out of the garden. But it was a memory they had. They can remember being in the garden where it was great. So what was the promise that God gave to Eve after the fall?
That from her would arise offspring that would ultimately crush the serpent's head.
So Adam and Eve's perspective would have been, it's going to be a child of Eve that's going to get them back into the garden.
Okay.
So Cain and Abel, Cain would have been the first, wow, this is exciting. But then Cain turns into a murderer and is cursed, right?
Yep.
So they go, that goes that hopes of getting back in the garden. And then Seth is born. The first thing, in fact, the only thing we really know about Seth, it was during his life that Adam and Eve had communicated enough to him that he and his offspring turned to worshiping the name of the Lord.
Okay.
Now, that could have been an effort to get back in the garden. It could have been a way of revering the God of the garden. But we have Seth as the first substantial dependent from Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have Enosh, his son. Now we go back to this verse. Well, men are starting to worship the Lord, and we have a lineage. We have Kenan and Mahalalel and Jared and Enoch and Methuselah and Lamech. Now, Enoch is a name that may stick out because Enoch was a person who did not die. You remember that?
Yeah, the Lord took him up.
Why? Because he walked faithfully with the Lord. So you have Seth producing a son who walks faithfully with the Lord, and that son is taken out of the world. Now, that means that son is not in the continuing line to the Messiah because he's in heaven.
Yeah.
So the line continues on. Now, what's interesting, after verse 3, you get the lineage of Adam, and then you get right to Noah. Now, in Noah, you have 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right?
Yep.
So you could say that after Adam and Eve, their children begin to have children. But if you notice, there's no lineage of the other kids. There's no lineage of Kenan, Jared, those guys. It gets right to Seth. And through Seth,
right,
Noah. Now, it's interesting that Noah represents, his name, in fact, is loosely translated, he may get us back.
Okay.
Because Adam and Eve are still hoping to produce that seed that God promised. What Adam and Eve didn't have was the perspective of the seed was really in a line that was going to produce the Messiah that was going to crush the head of Satan by doing away with sin forever. So they didn't have that perspective. From their
perspective, direct descendant.
Hey, we got to produce a seed because that's the way we're going to get back in the garden. And we see in this lineage that the next significant line is Noah. Now, there's interesting thing. If we notice in verse 4, Noah and his family are mentioned. Shem is first, Ham is second, Japheth is next. Then there is another kind of a digression of saying, now, Japheth produces Gomer and Magog and a bunch of people. The firstborn is Gomer, and he produces a bunch of people, verse 6. And then Javan is the middle of the kids, and he produces a bunch of people. And then it goes back to Ham. Now, what's weird about that? What's weird about verse 5 and verse 8? And then we're going to go down to Shem a little later. What's weird?
Why go into detail on some of their kids if they're not part of the line?
Yeah, now it's interesting. They go into Japheth, his kids, and one of his kids, they go into a line, and the middle kid goes into the line, but then there's nothing from then on.
Right.
If you notice, it gives, okay, this is the son is here, and then he has a son, but then the lineage stops. It doesn't go into, and his son was, and his son was. We talked about this last week, that this is not meant to be a complete history of all the families of Israel. This is meant to just move the narrative along. In fact, it's weird because there's no narrative. It just moves the story along through key individuals that are going to produce this line. Now, the other thing that's weird about these verses is it gives the sons of Noah, Shem, who's the
Ham.
next?
Ham.
Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But then it reverses the order. Instead of starting with the firstborn son, it starts with the lastborn son, just to get that lineage out of the way. Then it moves to the middle son. So it's strange. And if you stop and say, why does he reverse the order instead of doing all the others start with the oldest and go down through the brothers? But in this case, he reverses it, starts with the last brother and goes to the first brother. Now, why do you think that is?
Oh, kind of like you were saying it. Maybe it's just a way to get it out of the way. There's some key figures in the last two brothers. Now let's focus on Shem.
Yeah, Shem is the one that's going to produce the direct lineage.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a way of saying, here are the three sons of Noah. This is important because Noah is a pinch in history, a place where all the generations, all the other brothers and sisters of Seth die because it's only his line, apparently, that worships God. All the other descendants are killed in the flood because it's only Seth and his direct relations that go to Noah. And Noah, only his family goes on the ark. So everyone else is judged and is out of the picture. And it ends with that last child, which is really the first child, Shem. Now, we're going to see some interesting things here. We're going to see in Japheth, I tried to make this so we could understand it a little bit better. Japheth connects down here to verse 5. And over here, Ham connects down to verse 8. The sons of Ham were, and under Japheth, he had Gomer, and that connects down to verse 6. And Javan connects down to verse 7. You see how that is progressing. The rest of the people mentioned, all these other names, they just are not relevant in the line to the Messiah. So they're mentioned, but that's it. And none of their kids are mentioned because they're not in the line. So then we have Ham, in verse 8. And then for Shem, we go all the way down to verse 17. Now, before we do, I want us to go to Ham for a minute, and we're going to look at those verses because we notice something else changes. We have Ham, and then under Ham, we're Cush. We see he is in verse 9. We have Mizraim. Mizraim is mentioned in verse 11, and Put is there, but he's not mentioned anywhere. And then there's Canaan. Now, Canaan is a cursed tribe because of viewing the nakedness of Noah. If you want to go look it up, you can certainly do that in Genesis. So he's out of the picture. But something we notice, And he's connected down to 13. And we're going to start to see some interesting things here. Then in Cush, it talks about Cush's kids. And then it goes, Cush became the father of Nimrod, a mighty one on the earth. Now, in verse 10, we see something new in the book of First Chronicles. What do you see in that verse? Go ahead and read it. It doesn't have a lot of weird names.
All right. Cush father Nimrod began to be a mighty one on the earth.
What's unique in the book of First Chronicles about that verse?
It's more than a name.
Okay.
It talks about this guy.
This is the first time he adds a comment. And it's a comment that leads us in this history. But it's important to do this because only another place this week, we're going to see another comment. So you set this precedent of saying there's a comment. This is the first time that it's gone beyond just the list, like you mentioned. And then he goes, okay, Nimrod, he became a mighty man on the earth. And then it goes back to the kids, Mizraim, and then down here, and we have now, I want us to just look at verse 11. Mizraim became the father of the people of Lud, Anam, Lahab, Pathras, Kausala, from which the Philistines came, and Captor. Now, in verse 11 and 12, we see another new thing for us to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's talking about whole tribes or groups of people now, not just individuals.
Right. Now starts a pattern where a certain person produces. Remember, the word begot is just basically produces. So this idea of a person is going to produce an entire group of people.
Yeah.
All right. Now, at the beginning, after the flood, they're all there with Noah and the kids are there. And then you start to see the kids having kids, and those kids produce groups of people.
Right.
So we start to see this perspective of the history of the Jews really becomes a history of humanity by naming the sources or the origins of whole people groups. That makes sense where he's going?
Yeah, it does.
So you can see very clearly the agenda of the chronicler from the very start. Now we're getting into the father of the people. And it goes here, from which the Philistines came. The Jews reading this, the book of Chronicles, would have absolutely known this is the Philistines.
Okay.
So the interpreters just gave that to us as the Philistines so that we could keep track of the narrative. And then Canaan is mentioned down here. He became the father of Sidon. And if you notice, verse 14, Canaan becomes the father of the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Gershites, and the Hebrews. I had a friend who was reading this one time, and he went through these names, and then he put in the mosquito bites, because there's a lot of ites there.
Yeah.
This is a case where we see this pattern of a group of people through another son, and these people become significant in the history of the Messiah later. He's going to run into problems with people from Canaan.
Right.
The Canaanite people, the Jebusites and others are going to become a problem for the people of Israel because they're not going to look favorably on them coming back through the land. Is this making sense as far as what we're doing?
Yeah.
Progressing through these names? Do you think we're on the right track?
I think so.
Okay. All right. As long as you think we're doing good, if we start to get even stranger, let me know. So if we don't follow it. Now let's continue on to this next verse. This same thing continues. We're back to Shem now. So this is the firstborn. From Shem were born a bunch of kids. And the only one that's really mentioned here is this one. In verse 18, you see that line. And there's no other line here. And then you get from him, we get Shelah. And for Eber, 2 sons were born. One was Peleg. And there's another comment here in verse 19. You see it?
His days the earth was divided. I assume that means the Tower of Babel happened and God dispersed the people by changing their language.
Okay, remember at the beginning, right? The kids of all the sons of Noah stayed right in that area, and they began to go down the wrong path and decided they were going to use their own abilities to build the Tower of Babel. And God said, that's not going to happen. And he gave them all different languages and divided the world. Now, what is our perspective now, today, of that little phrase that the world was divided?
I think we see that's why there's people around the world. It's not just in the Middle East, but people in every continent.
So God had a plan.
Yeah.
So God starts to reveal his plan. The Tower of Babel did not surprise God. He didn't go, oh, no, I have to panic because they're building this tower. No, this was a plan all along. He knew men were going to digress and they were going to sin. And he knew that he was going to divide the earth into these tribes and nations that would later become the Gentile nations.
Yeah.
So we look here, and he goes, in his days, the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. And he is mentioned down here in 20. He goes down to become the father of these. Now, very interesting. There's a whole bunch of kids. He becomes the father of verse 20, 21, 22, 23, and that stops. There's no more genealogies of any of his kids.
Okay.
Because again, that is not significant in this historical chronicle of the Messiah. So we see it again.
Yeah.
This is not all-inclusive history. This is just history that moves the point of what he's trying to do. We go back to the firstborn son. We go back to Shem. Now, in verse 24 to 27, he doesn't use the term begot or fathered. It's just a progression of names. And Shelah is one of the names. Shelah was the son of Shem. So Shem is his grandfather. Through him, Eber, Peleg, Reu, we don't know anything about them, Nahor, and Terah. And from Terah, Abram, that is Abraham. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 10, verse 28 and 29.
All right. Well, Abimael, Sheba, am I reading the right thing? All of these were the sons of Joktan.
Okay. We just got done reading that as the sons of Joktan.
Okay.
So you have those under Shem, you have these sons, including Joktan up here in verse 20.
Okay.
But then it goes on to, there's more kids mentioned. And the only reason they're mentioned is because they're in a direct line to probably the key figure in verse 27. The most significant person in the narrative is Abram. Now, one of the commentaries that I looked at made the note of the first 27 verses moves us from pre-recorded history, what is categorized as prehistory, up to Abram. And Abram becoming Abraham is the first verse of history where we can start to look. So we have first 27 verses move us from prehistory to history. It also moves us from the first man to the first Jew. So again, in the goal, objective of the chronicler, he wants to move the story. He wants to move us as the reader from that first man so that we can see the cord of history to the first Jew. And then it becomes a chronicle of the Jews producing the temple and producing Jerusalem and producing King David and producing Messiah.
Okay. Yeah, a lot packed in 27 verses.
There's just things, and we're going to do that. We're going to look at things to be observed. We're not going to try to endlessly pronounce these names. We can make observations from those verses and try to connect the names that we do recognize. and say, all of a sudden, this name produces a bunch, this one name produces some, but the other names just fall off the agenda.
Yeah.
And that helps us. And we can stop and say, praise God that he gave us not myth about how Jesus comes about, but he gives us a chronology mentioning people, giving us some details of the chronology, not a complete chronology, but it's details of a history that moves us forward to the agenda of a history of Messiah, a history of our Savior. So as we're reading this, we can say, man, I love the fact that God's interested in people and people are moved by God for his plan, for his agenda. And all this is the agenda to be faithful to the promise given to Eve in the garden. Your seed is going to produce one that crushes the head of Satan. And that's the story of how Messiah comes about and how he's going to hang on a tree and crush the plan in Satan's head. And we're going to see that as we continue on. We'll talk about that a number of more times. Any other observations? Anything you want to say?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how a lot of these names you find in other spots in the Bible. And in some sense, like I'm even thinking like Magog, I think you read about it again in Revelation. It's got Tarshish, it's got the Philistines, the Jebusites, which I think weren't they in Jerusalem before Jerusalem was conquered. So it's interesting to see throughout Israel's history that they have conflict with people who are outside of God's promised people who are in these other parts of the genealogy.
We could say, okay, in history from Abram, we can see these names are real places, real people. Archaeology is digging up proof of these guys all the time. So we can assume, because these are factual names that lead us factually, historically, to Jesus on the cross, we can say the prehistory names are also as valid. The chronicler is being just as careful with these names as he's going to be with the names in history.
Yeah.
A good observation. We're going to see a lot of names pop up, and they'll pop up through history and be used over and over again in God's plan to move mankind, the Gentile nations. In fact, all Gentiles are related to the Jews. Why? Because they're all descendants from Noah.
Yeah.
They become nations as this history goes along. They become nations that are not in the line of Messiah, and they become nations that don't worship God, as we've seen other kids of the major figures do that. They go off, and God has to deal with them. But the Gentile nations are a heritage from Noah, from his descendants. These nations become nations, and that leads to the Gentile nations. So when it's talking in Psalms, when it says, and the nations will shake their fist at you, Lord, it's talking about the nations that were produced by the kids of Noah.
That's interesting.
An interesting perspective for us as we're studying our history.
Yeah.
In the book of First Chronicles.
It's a lot of years covered in 27 verses. Cool to see the thread just of God's faithfulness through that. And it's clear that it's part of his plan, like you're saying.
Yep. And to God, it doesn't bother him that it takes 1,000 years or 100 years. He's going to move his plan heading towards his son, Jesus, on the cross. That's a cool thing. Today, we've been talking about the genealogy of Adam, really the progress from the first man to the first Jew. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called, Should Jews Be Important to Christians? It's out of the book of Romans, and I think you'll find it a blessing. It goes right along with the study in First Chronicles, which will continue next week. And until then, God bless you.